I hope I hope in the editing that I can sound like a relatively sane person. Or not. I don't know. I guess it's okay as long as I'm entertaining.
As long as you're interesting, it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
But yeah, I will edit, so yeah,
Okay.
the rough edges will get smoothed out. This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. Before I tell you about Kasper Mutzenmacher's cursed hat, I just want to remind you that you can get an autographed copy of Serendipity's Footsteps, the book you heard about on our last episode, by becoming a Book of Life supporter at patreon.com/bookoflife. It's a great book. I know you'll like it. Now let's talk about today's interview. Kasper Mutzenmacher's Cursed Hat is a weird and wonderful novel that mixes the complexities of real history with the strange and the supernatural. I spoke to author Keith Fenton-Miller by Skype at his home in Washington, D.C. Keith, you describe yourself on Twitter as skeptic, feminist, consumer protection attorney. So, can you explain why those 5 words sum you up?
One very significant aspect of my worldview has to do with epistemology, how we know what we know, inspired by a teacher I had in high school, Dr. Charles Freemuth, who sort of turned me on to this concept in a theory of knowledge class. So I think the idea of looking at things skeptically, looking at the sources of information, weighing them out, trying to be aware as best we can of our biases is, in my view, the best way to approach life. It's led to a lot of questioning, quite naturally, certainly of my faith, and as a consumer protection attorney for the Federal Trade Commission, I'm often dealing with advertising claims that are outrageous or questionable from a scientific standpoint. So that brings in that whole skeptical component. I think that's why it holds such a strong appeal for me. And the feminism aspect, I think I was always a feminist, even if I didn't label myself as such, but I didn't really understand it as a worldview until law school, when I took a couple classes with Professor Catherine McKinnon, who's one of the leading legal thinkers in the feminist area. I was also heavy into analyzing the foundation of Jewish faith in terms of Jewish law, halakha. I actually took a Jewish law class there at the University of Michigan. And there's just, women have a diminished role in traditional Judaism. There are counter-arguments about how, well, women are more spiritual and they have their domain in the home and men have it when they're studying the Talmud. But ultimately, putting on my skeptic hat, I didn't buy those arguments. So those things were kind of working together.
So, on the one hand, I thoroughly enjoyed Kasper Mutzenmacher's Cursed Hat. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I don't even know where to start. It's very weird. So, can you tell us the elevator pitch for this book and explain your inspiration for it?
Sure. It's really about a family of Berlin hat makers in the Jazz Age in 1923. And this family has been cursed to sell hats for 15 centuries because Kasper Mutzenmacher's ancient Greek ancestor stole the god Hermes' wishing hat. This was a hat, according to Greek myth, that Hermes would use to pop around the world and also transport souls to the afterworld. Fate imposed a curse on the family to sell hats for purposes of an elevator pitch. This is a very long ride, by the way. It's a very tall building. Yeah. But the inciting event is when Kasper goes to a jazz cabaret, meets a flapper named Asana, but then she's immediately taken prisoner by this mysterious Klaus character. He's known as the stealer of faces because he's been kidnapping women, interrogating them, and releasing them days later with no apparent harm except for the fact that they can't see their faces. Kasper then has to use the hat to rescue Asana. Then suddenly the family is on Klaus's radar, and that puts them in great danger, where they actually have to escape Germany on the eve of Kristallnacht.
So what inspired this story?
Well, a couple things. One, is my grandfather. He's passed away 20 years ago, Dr. Merle Fenton. We called him Papa, and in the novel, Kasper's called Pops. But when I would write Pops, I would think Papa. He was squat and had a big nose, like Kasper. Papa didn't have a scar, and he wasn't cursed, as far as I know. But he really bound our family together just through the sheer force of his personality, this gravitas that he had. But Kasper is sort of an alternative Papa. And the analogy to my story is both Kasper's personality, but also the underlying curse. More broadly, thematically, there's kind of a recurrent motif of empty spaces, emptiness in sculptures, in souls, and the idea of filling those empty spaces. The hat itself is basically fabric wrapped around an empty space. And so this concept of the empty center is something that I think about a lot. And in trying to figure out why that is, one incident that I kept coming back to was something that happened when I was probably about 10. And my family used to have a Sunday breakfast tradition with bagels, cream cheese, lox, eggs, the whole 9 yards. And the topper was this Sara Lee pecan coffee cake that we'd have for dessert. I loved it. Anyway, so one day when I was 10, my dad carved out the entire center of the cake and served it to himself, leaving just a thin, bready rind for the rest of us. And sort of anticipating our protests, he raises his hand and declares, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. It's from that high holiday prayer. I mean, it was just ridiculous. He had no business invoking anything even remotely biblical. I mean, this was a guy who smothered his bagel with cream cheese and bacon, simultaneously breaking the rules against eating pork and mixing meat with dairy. The ancient rabbis might have called this sandwich. I was thinking, yeah, that would be a real FU sandwich, I think, for the ancient rabbis. And you know, I'm not judging him. I mean, because we all ate FU sandwiches, and I ate mine with sliced tomato and red onion. They were good. But the shock of that, because every time before we'd all gotten appropriately sized triangles of Sara Lee pecan coffee cake. But here, he carved the entire heart out of the cake. The soul of the cake was gone, the best part. So that concept of the empty center really stuck with me, and I think that's why, you know, from a psychological perspective, I may have been inspired to write about a hat maker because, as I said before, what is a hat but fabric wrapped around the empty center? And I think we're trying to fill that center. That's kind of what we're doing in life.
Did your father ever explain why he did that?
Well, conveniently, he just doesn't have any recollection of it. I could be imagining this event. I've actually thought about that too. Well, maybe this is something that I dreamed. Maybe it didn't actually happen. Now, I could ask my brothers, but I'm 98.9% certain that that occurred. And even if it didn't occur, the fact that it resonates so strongly with me, I think is just significant in itself. It's almost not even that important whether it really happened.
So you've talked a little bit about why a hat seems significant to you, but why write a story about a cursed hat?
Well, I don't know if I set out to say I really need to write a cursed hat story. I think it evolved that way. I latched onto Greek myth. The concept of tradition, I think, is the thing that I really wanted to focus on. And what a curse does is it kind of makes it very literal. This cursed hat is literally something that is passed down through the generations. Well, that's what a tradition is too, Jewish tradition. Whether, you know, prayers and observances and things like that, they're not as concrete as a hat. But I think the cursed hat is a physical device that makes it much more real and immediate. So I think that's why I settled on a cursed hat.
The origin story of the hat is from thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So why did you choose Nazi Germany as the opening setting?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because the fact is I have written a narrative story of what happened in ancient Greece, and then there's actually another 50,000 words of what happened in Leghorn, Italy in the 1600s. This stuff is alluded to in the book. But why start it in Nazi Germany? Well, I've written this as a trilogy, but I didn't start out that way. It started out just as a contemporary book with the hat myth in it, It all took place in the present, and there was a little section where the Chance character, we get to go into his house and we see a photo of his grandfather, of Kasper Leghorn. It's a photo of him wearing one of his creations, one of the more whimsical creations that he made, a hat that was designed to look like a woman's permanent wave hairdo, because at that particular time in Berlin, the chemicals to make a permanent wave hairdo were absent. So in this fictional account, I have him creating a hat that sort of simulated the look of the perm. And this idea of sort of the whimsy in probably one of the darkest times in human history, certainly in Jewish history, the contrast between those two things really fascinated me. And so that one image that I created just for purposes of creating the environment of Chance's house in, I don't know, in the 1990s in Virginia, that inspired me to delve into his background and really get into the guts of his family. And setting it in Nazi Germany makes it very dramatic. It allows me to draw on my knowledge of Jewish tradition, and I just think it makes it a more compelling story. So that's why I went back and I wrote Kasper Mutzenmacher's Cursed Hat. That would be the first story. The second story, which I've written, picks up in the 1970s. Instead of focusing on race and religion so much, it's focusing more on sex discrimination and race discrimination, and it's this other side of the curse with this other family. And then the third book kind of brings the two together. So why did I start in Nazi Germany telling the story there instead of starting in 384 AD? It's much easier than it would be to write a story of people in togas and the fall of marble temples. It just was much closer to home for me, writing about something set during the prelude to the Holocaust.
Okay. Identity is rather fluid in this story, from name changes to changes in racial labeling and even changes in gender identity. Why was this a theme that you wanted to explore?
Names are something that's really occupied a lot of my thinking. The arbitrariness of names is a source of personal identity. Just a little background on me. I changed my name when I got married. I was Fenton, and my wife was Miller. And I didn't think it was fair that I should have to change my name, or she should have to change her name, the more traditional route, just because we're getting married. So we ended up abandoning both names and taking on a new name, Fenton Miller. We combined them. So this is something that I've lived, the fluidity of names. And I understand that as the generations proceed, this solution is not going to be tenable. If and when my children get married, and if they decide to do the same thing, they'll have a name that's 200 words long. But yes, it's true. Mutzenmachers, they used to be the Leghorns, and they used to be the Tassos family back in Greece. The Nazis were very focused on names. They made the female Jews adopt the middle name Sarah. The men had to adopt the name Israel in their passports. The propaganda ministry was changing the names of colors. Medium blue became national blue. When people went to Ellis Island, they would change their names, or they may have to have forged names. And the Nazis were wiping out names off of World War I memorials. If you were a Jew, they would chisel your name off. So yes, there is a lot of fluidity there, both in terms of names and in terms of identity. I mean, what is Kasper's scar? Depending on how you look at it, it could look like a golf flag or the runic symbol for Thor. The Psy character, who we meet in Detroit, who's ostensibly a black man, but really he's half and half, yet he is pushed into a particular category by society. He's limited to where he could buy a house, and his employment opportunities are limited. So, yeah, I see life, I see identity as being extremely fluid. And this ties into the symbol of stealing faces, because that was one of the principal things that Hitler was trying to do from a propaganda perspective, was to create this face for the people that they could identify with. And then that would make it that much easier to make them compliant, because they'd see themselves reflected in this beautiful Nordic face. But that's a lie. The poet Rilke talks about how people have numerous faces. Well, if you extrapolate that out to a societal level, I mean, you can't even count the number of faces, of identities. Even one person doesn't have a particular identity. It's constantly fluid and changing. And so, yeah, that definitely reflects my perception of how identity works, that it's not fixed. And that's the same with tradition, that it shouldn't be fixed. It's constantly being evaluated and recreated by the next generation. Everything is fluid.
Why did you pick Detroit as a setting? Is that a city that has any personal meaning for you?
Yes. I grew up in Michigan. I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, not in the city of Detroit. My grandfather grew up there. My father grew up there. My wife's grandfather, her great-grandfather, and beyond grew up in Detroit. Detroit gets such a bad rap, and I feel for Detroit. You know, it was such a thriving metropolis up until the early 50s, and then the decay set in, and it's just so sad. But now it's coming back, which is wonderful. You know, even the identity of a city is fluid. So, yes, it has a deep personal connection to me. Also, I was able to connect the riots of Kristallnacht with the riots in Detroit in 1943. There was just kind of a nice symmetry there.
Let's talk about Tikkun Olam, or repairing the world.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way in which this book can help heal the world?
Well, the fundamental thrust of the book maybe would be captured from one of the images near the end of the book. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but let's just say Kasper lives to a ripe old age, but he dies and there's a funeral. And his creations, his hats, show up to his funeral, you know, from all walks of life in Detroit, black and white, male, female. And all the hats are different. They're all unique creations. But there's a thread running through all those hats. It is literal in the sense that there's this color, the color indigo, which somehow he's worked into each of these hats. Sometimes obvious, sometimes subtle. Sometimes you can only see it in the reflected light. But that color, that universal color, unites all these unique creations. And so I think to the extent that the book may foster this concept that we can celebrate our differences, yet still be unified in this same struggle to survive, and finding the joy in those struggles, I think, is what unifies us as human beings. So I think thematically, if people take that away, I think maybe just a little bit of Tikkun Olam.
Okay, excellent. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that I haven't asked you?
I guess maybe the one thing is, this is book one of what I call the Life Indigo series. And I mentioned indigo before. Well, why Life Indigo? And Life Indigo derives from Duke Ellington's classic Mood Indigo. The lyric of that song that stands out to me is, "You ain't been blue till you've had that mood indigo." The idea is that Kasper's burdened. He's a cursed man. He suffers through a lot of sadness. Yet he finds beauty in this color. He celebrates it in his creations, in his jazz, in those blue notes. And so he embraces both the color and the feeling of indigo, both literally and psychologically. So that's why I chose Life Indigo for the series title, because that theme will definitely carry through the other two books.
Keith Fenton Miller, thanks so much for speaking with me.
Thank you, Heidi. My pleasure.
Hi, this is Marjorie Engel, author of Mamala Knows Best. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life podcast, and I would like to dedicate this episode to my mother, Dr. Carol K. Engel, who told me the anecdote about Isidore Isaac Rabi that was actually the genesis for this whole entire book.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. If you do, you'll get an autographed copy of Serendipity's Footsteps by Suzanne Nelson while supplies last. You can also help us out by leaving a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast or follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561 206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida, at cbiboca.org, and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.